So first, I'm going to give some background and history for St. Petersburg, and I focus on the imperial period. And then I'll turn to theorizations of the city, including Brodsky, and its connection with Russian literature. After that, I'll share and comment on some excerpts from Petersburg works by Pushkin, Gogol, and Dostoevsky. And finally, I'll speak about some lesser-known texts and authors whose works contribute to mapping this 19th century city as a network of diverse literary genres. Some of this material is drawn from my book, Mapping St. Petersburg, but that book was published 20 years ago, and I have continued to work on Petersburg and to teach the subject all along. Okay, so first slide. Here's my book. So here's a map of Russia, and you can see both Moscow and St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is what we call an eccentric city, meaning at the edge of Russian imperial space. It's located on the Neva River at the mouth of the Finnish Gulf, which extends from the Baltic Sea. Moscow, in contrast, is a concentric city rather than an eccentric one. Moscow sits at the heart of Russia. Today, St. Petersburg is a federal city of Russia with 5.5 million residents. It's the next largest Russian city after Moscow, which has about 13 million. St. Petersburg was founded by Tsar Peter the Great in 1703 on empty marshlands. And it was conceived as and has always been considered the most Western-looking Russian city. So here are the marshlands, empty marshlands, and here's a map of the city as it was in the middle of the 19th century. You can see this is you can see the main part, and you can see this island, Vasilievsky Island, and the Petersburg side here, the small fortress. So you can see that the city, the Neva River snakes through the city, and there are also canals that go along the main embankment. And there are 3 radial prospects coming out from the power center, one of which is the famous Nevsky Prospect. And, you know, places like the Petersburg side and the outer parts of Vasilievsky Island are where more modest and poor people lived. So it was very odd to create a great new European style capital in this way in the 18th century from scratch. And there was a tremendous self-consciousness and bravado about Peter the Great's enterprise. But his project also came at great human cost. Thousands of laborers died trying to establish structures on unstable swamplands. This will give you a sense of St. Petersburg and its larger environs. You can see the pieces that I showed you on the zoomed in map. But you can also see the palace parks of the Tsars, Tsarskaya Selo and Pavlovsk here to the south, and then along the southern coast of the Finnish Gulf, Oranienbaum, Peterhof, and Strelna. In his 1844 essay, Petersburg and Moscow, the famous Russian literary critic Vissarion Belinsky argued with those who characterized Petersburg as a city without a history, as evidenced by its lack of ancient historical monuments. He wrote, "Yes, dear sirs, there are no such monuments in Petersburg, and there can be none, because Petersburg has existed since the day of its founding for only 141 years. However, Petersburg itself is a great historical monument in the extraordinary fact of its existence." And for comparison, we can date Rome back to the 8th century BC, London to the 11th century with prehistory, Paris to the 12th century, also with prehistory, Warsaw to the 16th century, Moscow to the 13th century. So you can see Petersburg is very late to the game and very unusual. The city, as a city, and as a concept, is riven with contradictions and has a bifurcated identity. On the one hand, it is rational and linear. I showed you the radial prospects, and you can see the grid structure. And so in that sense, it's very planned. But on the other hand, it's kind of an unnatural city because it didn't develop organically from a settlement. It was a mad scheme, if you will. And urban legends abounded in Petersburg, perhaps as a result, as did a persistent apocalyptic sense of the end, which I'll return to in a moment. Here are some famous pronouncements about Petersburg that capture some of the contradictions. Count Francesco Algarotti, who visited in the early 18th century, called it this great window lately opened in the north through which Russia looks into Europe. The historian Nikolai Karamzin, who wrote the first multi-volume history of the Russian Empire, called it Peter's brilliant mistake, founded on tears and corpses. The poet Alexander Pushkin called it the foyer of Russia, and what he means is the vast imperial bureaucracy was centered there, and the foyer, meaning people who had to sit around waiting in foyer areas for the important bureaucrat to see them. Maybe the most famous declaration is Dostoevsky, the most abstract and premeditated city in the world. That's from his Notes from Underground. The artist Alexander Benoit, the incomprehensible and hated sergeant of Russia. This refers to Russia being the center of the Russian military, including the navy that Peter the Great founded, but also refers to the autocratic policing of its population. And finally, the cultural historian Nikolai Ansiferov, who wrote a very famous cultural study called The Soul of Petersburg in the early 1920s. He called it the city of tragic imperialism. Now, I'm going to give you a little more history. As mentioned, the city was founded in 1703, and it was named St. Petersburg after St. Peter, not after Peter the Great, as some people think. Peter the Great officially transferred the imperial capital from Moscow to his new city in 1713. He laid the foundation stone of the city himself, and the foundation stone was on this Peter Paul fortress that I pointed out on the 19th century map. It was constructed on an island on the main channel of the Neva to secure the Russian presence and to block the forces of the Swedish Empire from entering the Neva. The Swedes were definitively defeated by Peter in 1721 at the end of the Great Northern War. Now you can see that the architecture of the church, the spire, this church dedicated to Saints Peter and Paul, very much resembles the 17th century Baroque architecture of Northern Europe. And you can see how different it is from the 16th century architecture of the famous St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square, which is an extravaganza of bright colors and onion domes. Peter imported Western technologies and architects to create Petersburg, and the city's initially Baroque, then Rococo and neoclassical features were elaborated during the 18th and 19th centuries. And the architecture of St. Petersburg includes many grand projects, such as the General Staff Building, which is the military headquarters, with a huge sculptural work depicting Nike and her victory chariot on top. This is the stock exchange at the tip of the Vasilievsky Island with its sculptural grouping with Neptune, the god of the sea, at the center. The Kazan Cathedral, which became a memorial to their Russian victory in 1812. St. Isaac's Cathedral, which resembles St. Peter's in Rome and St. Paul's in London. I thought I had a slide. Yes, the Admiralty. This was the center for building shipyards, and its golden spire is often referred to. And Pushkin refers to it in the prologue to his poem, The Bronze Horseman, which I'll be talking about later. So 2 slides of Moscow to kind of give you a visual emphasis for the difference in the look of these 2 cities. So this is a vintage postcard of the Kremlin as seen from a bridge or an embankment. You can see it's a riot of onion domes inside the Kremlin churches, and the fortress-like medieval-looking crenellated brick wall. And this is a postcard of old Moscow based on a painting. This is a 19th century imagining of 17th century Moscow. with its small wooden dwellings and small twisty alleys. And you can see St. Basil's in the background. So St. Petersburg was conceived as an imperial capital and a showpiece, the seat of the Russian imperial court, the imperial bureaucracy, the military, and a European-style cultural center. Peter compelled many aristocratic families to build mansions there, especially along the main embankments, so those houses would be impressively visible as ships entered the Neva and approached the city center. St. Petersburg quickly became Russia's largest seaport and the most important center of foreign trade, which increased 15 times over in the 18th century. St. Petersburg was thus also Russia's leading emporium of foreign goods, with thousands of merchants and craftsmen establishing businesses in the city. The shipyards of the Admiralty, which I showed you a moment ago, the culminating point of the three radial prospects, was the largest industrial complex in 18th century Russia. But Petersburg's most distinctive feature is what Brodsky calls a giant aquatic square in a foreign architectural frame. So here's a view from the Neva of the stock exchange at the tip of Vasilievsky Island and the rostral columns. So this is all very glorious, but then there's this other side, as I mentioned, the bifurcated identity of St. Petersburg. As a low-lying city without a system of protective dikes, Petersburg was vulnerable to assault by the elements, including all of Vasilievsky Island and the Petersburg side, and a large portion of the city center. Imperial Petersburg could be subject to as much as an 8-meter rise in water when powerful westerly winds reversed the flow that would normally empty into the Gulf of Finland. And in the worst cases, the reverse movement of the Neva caused Petersburg's internal waterways, its canals and hydraulic systems, to join forces with the advancing flood to turn against the city. The 1824 flood was the worst in the city's history, responsible for thousands of deaths, and it became the subject of Alexander Pushkin's 1833 long poem, The Bronze Horseman. So the cultural semiotician Yuri Lotman points out that for Petersburg, there's kind of a reverse opposition between stone and water. Usually we imagine that stone is permanent and water is kind of evanescent. But in Petersburg's case, stone is impermanent and water is permanent, a fact of the city's life and an always threatening presence. So St. Petersburg is likened to the eternal Rome, but also to doomed Constantinople. This is a famous painting by the Russian artist Karl Brylov from the early 1830s called The Last Day of Pompeii, and it received a great deal of attention when it was first exhibited to Russian viewers. It was taken to be an allegory of St. Petersburg. Now I would like to talk about the two most iconic structures in the city. The first one is this monument to Peter the Great, a statue commissioned by Catherine the Great from a French sculptor, Falconet, to honor Peter, unveiled in 1782. You can see the inscription on the stone. Falconet chose to represent Peter not as a Roman emperor in armor, but instead in a simple smock, cloak, and boots. And although a classical laurel wreath crowned his head, a folkloric bearskin served as his saddle. And then there's the granite base of the monument, a monolith called the Colossus Stone, a mammoth boulder split by lightning, transported across the Finnish Gulf from swamplands deep in a forest, a complicated operation that took 4 months and over 1,000 laborers. But despite the choice of non-classical garb for Peter and the pedestal linked to the imperial capital's distinctive setting, this monument to Peter the Great recalls the famous equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius on the Capitoline in Rome, in its classical identification of a ruler as lawgiver and military commander associated with a great empire's golden age, and making the gesture of the outstretched hand, palm down. But note that the Marcus Aurelius statue stands on a regular shaped pedestal, and the horse's posture is much more sedate than the posture of the horse in the Russian monument. In contrast, Peter confidently reins in the horse, controlling its flight, while with his right hand outstretched, he seems to be affirming victory, the triumph of the new Petrine Russia and all of its modernization projects. The horse gallops like Russia, and the horse and rider represent the Tsar and the people. But you see, there's also a snake by the horse's feet, and the snake was meant by the sculptor to signify the evil and envy of those who opposed Peter's great projects. But it was also interpreted as a sign of the city's coming destruction. The second most iconic structure in Petersburg is the Winter Palace on the main embankment, now called the Palace Embankment. This palace is so large, it can only be held in full view from the Neva, or from the tip of Vasilevsky Island, where the stock exchange is. It is, as you can see, a Baroque extravaganza of ornamental vases, statues, and syncopated columns, and gives the effect of motion, almost of flying or floating. The Winter Palace was at the very center of Tsarist St. Petersburg, the focus of the political and cultural life of the empire beginning in the 18th century. It was the hub of the imperial court. It was the official residence of the imperial family and the location for grand occasions such as balls, fetes, and diplomatic receptions. And the square in front of the palace was also used for military reviews. In the center, you can see the Alexander Column that was erected to commemorate the 1812 victory over Napoleon. And you can see the Grand Staff headquarters with the Nike chariot. But also, the Winter Palace has other sides to its history. So, for example, the 1905 events of Bloody Sunday, when peaceful protesters came with a petition for the Tsar and were gunned down by the Tsar's soldiers. Or the even more mythic October 1917 storming of the Winter Palace by the Bolsheviks to overthrow the provisional government. Now, this so-called storming is a much mythologized event that was really much more modest than it appears here, where there's a flame-like mob rushing in like a wave. And there were many staged reenactments of this taking of the Winter Palace, perhaps most famously Sergei Eisenstein's 1928 film October, created to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the revolution. But there are other more recent staged enactments of retaking, including in the post-Soviet period, the director Alexander Sokurov's film from 2002, Russian Ark, shot inside the Hermitage in a single 90-minute take. And what you see is an actor playing the Marquis de Custine, a real person, a French aristocrat who visited Petersburg in 1839 and wrote about it. During the second half of the 19th century, Petersburg became a bustling metropolis. The 1861 emancipation of the serfs set many social forces in motion. There was an enormous influx of migration from the countryside. And the rapid economic development during this time put a strain on the physical and administrative structures in Petersburg. There were inadequate facilities for water supply and waste disposal. The city was plagued by cholera and typhus. Cellars were converted into living spaces, apartments subdivided to create corners for renters, and there were ever increasing numbers of homeless and temporary shelters. Petersburg was known at this time as one of the unhealthiest cities in Europe. By 1914, 3/4 of the city's inhabitants were peasants, whereas 50 years earlier, it had been less than a third. So petty trade was still a big part of life in the capital, with peasants hawking wares on the streets. But many peasants were also becoming urbanized, and many became factory workers, the future proletariat of Marxist theory. And industrial development really was the catalyst for urban growth in the outskirts of St. Petersburg. with these smokestacks that Brodsky points out echo the colonnades of the historic structures. The second half of the 19th century changes the traditional neoclassicism of Petersburg architecture, and there is a lot of new architectural eclecticism, a mixing of different historical styles. And this is the Beloselski-Velizersky Palace on Nevsky Prospect, which is the kind of thing that Brodsky thought was horribly vulgar, but I actually like it. I'm sure plenty of people like architectural eclecticism. He's kind of a purist and a classicist. Another building from this later imperial period is the Singer Sewing Machine building on Nevsky Prospect, a kind of modernist structure. And this building became the House of Books during the Soviet period, the biggest, most important bookstore in Petersburg. Okay, so that's the, no, actually now I'm moving forward to the post-revolutionary period. When Brodsky refers to the city as the renamed city, he's talking about renaming the city Leningrad. But before that, St. Petersburg had been renamed Petrograd in 1914 because the original name sounded too German at a very patriotic World War I moment. In 1918, the Soviets transferred the seat of government back to Moscow, just as Petersburg had transferred the capital from Moscow to Petersburg in 1713. After Lenin's death, the city was renamed Leningrad in 1924, and it took on a new identity as the cradle of the revolution. Although, as Brodsky reminds us, it was affectionately called Peter by residents during the Soviet period. The Hermitage, the former Winter Palace, became one of the world's major art museums, drawing from the collections of the royals and aristocratic families. In its Leningrad incarnation, St. Petersburg had a tragic history. The city was under siege by the German Wehrmacht from 1941 till 1944, resulting in 1.5 million civilian and military deaths. Leningrad was the first Soviet city to be awarded the title Hero City for this reason. But after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the city's residents voted to restore its original name of St. Petersburg, and there was a great 2003 tricentennial celebration of the 300th anniversary of the city's founding with many events and architectural restoration projects. There were also anniversaries of St. Petersburg's founding celebrated in 2013, the 310th anniversary, 2018, the 315th anniversary, and 2023, the 320th anniversary. One of the palace parks that I pointed out, the Strelna Palace Park, had been in ruins, and it was renovated in time for 2003, and then later served as the location for a 2006 G8 summit and a 2013 G20 summit. But of course, these traditions of holding these summits in Russia ended in 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea. In 1990, the historic center of St. Petersburg and related groups of monuments became a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site. And the site includes the surrounding Imperial Palace parks, which are not shown here. But controversial new post-Soviet skyscrapers and building complexes began to appear during the 2000s, threatening the status of the historic center as a World Heritage Site and changing its appearance. Despite much opposition, the Lahta Center was constructed in the 20-teens on the shore of the Finnish Gulf to the north of the historic center. It is 87 stories high. You can see it from various points in the historic center, where it looks incongruous and changes the view. By an 1844 decree from Tsar Nicholas I, buildings in historic St. Petersburg could not be higher than the Winter Palace, which was about 5 stories. So the city's skyline was very consistent and it had been preserved. Mostly this was true through the Soviet period as well. So there was irony in the fact that it was the post-Soviet period that did the most damage to the landscape of the historic center. So that's the history, and now I'm going to turn to some theorizations of Petersburg. Here is Joseph Brodsky, a poet and essayist born in Leningrad from a Jewish family. Bilingual in English and Russian, the essay that I shared with you was written in English. Brodsky was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1972 as a dissident, settling in America. He was awarded the 1987 Nobel Prize in Literature for, quote, an all-embracing authorship imbued with clarity of thought and poetic intensity, and he was appointed United States Poet Laureate in 1991. Although invited back to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, Brodsky never returned. His Guide to a Renamed City is really one of the most gorgeous pieces of writing I know. It was written 7 years after Brodsky left Russia forever, so it is a reminiscence imbued with his own nostalgia. He covers both Imperial and Soviet history and the city's mythology and offers wonderful details about the physical experience of the city and its particularity as a place. Brodsky speaks to the idea of Petersburg as a new version of pre-existing cities, as a kind of copycat city. Svetlana Boehm described Petersburg as a city made of quotes and defined through the other cities of the world. So, for example, the 3 radial prospects were similar to those used in planning Rome in the 16th century, and also recall Versailles. And throughout its history, Petersburg has been called the Venice of the North, and as a city of canals has also been likened to Amsterdam. Brodsky writes, when the famous window on Europe, Count Algarotti's characterization, or in Brodsky's word, the sluices were opened, European architectural motifs gushed into and inundated St. Petersburg in a kind of version of the Petersburg theme of flooding. But he points out that there was so much empty space around the city that European architectural styles look like they've been blown up through a magic lantern and projected onto a screen of space and waters. For Brodsky, Petersburg is a fake. He writes, whatever the architects took for the standard in their work, Versailles, Fontainebleau, and so on, the outcome was always unmistakably Russian. After the 1917 revolution, when Petersburg was no longer the seat of government, the city suddenly looked empty with all its palaces and bureaucratic buildings and left to its reflections. I'm going to read this excerpt from Brodsky's essay. As the country, with its capital, returned to Moscow, retreated to its womb-like claustrophobic and xenophobic condition, Petersburg, having nowhere to withdraw to, came to a standstill, as though photographed in its 19th century posture. The decades that followed the Civil War didn't change it much. There were new buildings, but mostly in the industrial outskirts. Quiet, immobilized, the city stood watching the passage of seasons. When the crimson ball of the setting January sun paints the tall Venetian windows of the palaces and mansions with liquid gold, a freezing man crossing the bridge on foot suddenly sees what Peter had in mind when he erected these walls, a giant mirror for a lonely planet. The lower the thermometer falls, the more abstract the city looks. Minus 25 centigrade is cold enough, but the temperature keeps falling, as though having done away with people, river, and buildings, it aims for ideas, for abstract concepts. With the white smoke floating above the roofs, the buildings along the embankments more and more resemble a stalled train bound for eternity. A great phrase, a stalled train bound for eternity. So you could say, as Brodsky does, that Petersburg Center dodged a bullet in 1918 when the capital was moved back to Moscow, and then again in the late 1930s when a plan to reconstruct the city center was shelved and new construction projects, massive Soviet-era housing developments, were constructed only at the city's periphery. As I mentioned, after 1917, the Winter Palace was taken over completely by the Hermitage Museum, which was made up of initially from the Tsar's collections. And St. Petersburg became a kind of museum of the imperial period. So here's a tourist map from the Soviet period in English, which represents Petersburg as a collection of monuments and historic sites of interest. And this is the Masters of Art Cemetery at the very end of Nevsky Prospect, where many Russian writers and cultural luminaries, composers are buried, including Dostoevsky and Glinka. During the Soviet period, many of these graves were moved from other cemeteries to this Masters of Art Cemetery to create a kind of museum of dead, accomplished Russians. In the 1990s, the writer Alexander Skidan acknowledged Petersburg's primary function as the tomb of Russian imperial culture. He writes, "The museum principle, as everywhere manifested in Petersburg, gives rise to the nauseating sensation of unceasing déjà vu. Even the most recent of events are conserved, surrendered before our eyes into an archive, and transformed into reminiscence and petrified ruins." Now I'll turn to literature, sorry, another cemetery, to Petersburg as a city of words. So you can see this is a different kind of map of St. Petersburg. You can see the blue, the Neva River moving through, the tip of Vasilievsky Island, the fortress, etc. As Richard Lihan writes in his book, The City in Literature, a city possesses a literary signature as unmistakable as its own skyline and represents a transmitted literary paradigm, a topos, whose symbolic space creates a long shadow of literary precedent. So there is an intimate connection between the forms of literary representation and the structures of the urban environment that this literature depicts. Cultural materialist Raymond Williams finds that Dickens' ultimate vision of London lies in the form of his novels, such that the experience of the city is the fictional method, and the fictional method is the experience of the city. Nikolai Nikiforov, whom I mentioned before, the author of The Soul of Petersburg, he declared, "Petersburg has a soul, just as Petersburg is a literary character in its own right." The structuralist theorist Vladimir Toporov introduced and developed a concept called the Petersburg text. And by this, he referred to a kind of semantic unity, a certain kind of idea of St. Petersburg, which a great number of texts share. So conceptually, the Petersburg text might be considered, where's my handout of there, major Petersburg literary texts. So this is an example of an aspect of the Petersburg text, which might conceptually be considered a single text comprised of a corpus of individual texts, and a compound text that determines the features of future works. So Petersburg is itself both a text and a mechanism for generating new texts, if that doesn't sound too convoluted. Brodsky claims that the geographical reality of Petersburg was responsible for the burst of creative power that 19th century Russian literature represents. In his view, St. Petersburg provided the self-estrangement that Russians needed to create a literature. He writes, "If it's true that every writer has to estrange himself from his experience to be able to comment upon it, then the city, by rendering this alienating service, saved them a trip." Unquote. This literature was primarily created by an alienated class. We can't call it a middle class because such a thing didn't exist in Russia at the time. But these were people in between the wealthy and the poor, and their members also struggled to survive. They felt out of place or even without a place. These writers looked up to those above them and down to those below them, and they wrote about this experienced reality and spun it into literature. Peter's original 18th century ideal of the rationalist capital gradually changed as Petersburg grew its own history, developing an intense cultural memory over a compressed period due to its exceptionally intense intellectual life. Brodsky characterizes his city as not just an important seaport, but also as a metaphorical harbor, a place from which thoughts can depart. And we could even say that Russian literature comes into existence with the emergence of St. Petersburg. It's a bit of an overstatement, but one that also rings true. In his experience of the city, Brodsky emphasizes the weather and the strange northern light. He writes, "To walk under the sky along the brown granite embankments of this immense gray river is itself an extension of life and a school of farsightedness." He evokes the productivity of loneliness and solitude, of being removed from the hustle bustle of the present moment. And this experience, of course, is enhanced by the famous St. Petersburg white nights, which are caused by the city's high latitude north of the Arctic Circle. So from late May to mid-July, the sun never sets completely in Petersburg, resulting in a kind of a twilight that lasts all night. Brodsky describes the white nights as the most magic time in the city, when the buildings, deprived of shadows and their roofs rimmed with gold, look like a set of fragile china. Precise Petersburg geographies are often noted in literary works, with great specificity, many mentions of particular streets, neighborhoods, buildings, and landmarks. But also, these physical features of the city become part of the internal landscape of a character or writer's consciousness. So Dostoevsky, for example, is a precursor of a modernist subjective vision of the city, such as those that we find in the poems of Baudelaire, more of a modernist sensibility. The vocabulary of mental illness is part of the Petersburg lexicon, as defined by Toporov, and it features a rich selection of words to denote a troubled inner state: hopeless, feverish, anxious, morose, etc. The weather is a major character in the Petersburg literary traditions, which include many descriptions of the strange light, visions, eerie effects, the fog, the rain, the wind, and the tricks of perspective. And in this way, the city becomes unreal, a kind of optical illusion. And in Petersburg literature, and in our idea of it, it can become very difficult to distinguish the fictional from the real. There is a confusion of real and literary history. So we know where Raskolnikov, or Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, we know where he walked, and we know where Pushkin's Queen of Spades lived, even though these are fictional characters. I mentioned the giant aquatic square at the heart of the city, and also the canals that weave through. Brodsky speaks of these waters reflecting everything like mirrors, the inexhaustible multiplicity of the architectural features in what he calls an urban narcissism. So he describes Petersburg as a narcissistic city, accustomed to admiring its reflection in the surrounding water, and similarly addicted to literature for supplying images of itself, as though the city were constantly being filmed by its river, which discharges footage into the Finnish Gulf. That's such a nice image of Brodsky's. So now I'll turn to sampling a few major Petersburg literary texts. We'll start with Pushkin, because everything starts with Pushkin. It is said that Pushkin gave life to the Petersburg literary mythology with his 1833 narrative poem, The Bronze Horseman, subtitled A Petersburg Story. Nikolai Nikiforov declared, Pushkin is the creator of the image of Petersburg in the same measure as Peter the Great was the builder of the city itself. And Petersburg is also said to be responsible, Pushkin is also said to be responsible for the atmosphere that permeates the mythology of Petersburg, which the scholar Donald Fanger calls a constant equivocal mixing of the soberly realistic with the apparently fantastic. The Bronze Horseman depicts the 1824 flood, and in this poem, a poverty-stricken minor civil servant comes to the monument of Peter to curse it for his fiance's death by drowning, which he feels is a result of Peter the Great's arrogant decision to build the city on such low-lying ground. In Pushkin's poem, the horseman monument descends from the pedestal and chases the civil servant around the city until he goes mad. So here's an excerpt from the famous prologue to Pushkin's poem, which I'll read. I love thee, city of Peter's making. I love thy harmonies austere, and Neva's sovereign waters breaking along her banks of granite sheer. Thy traceried iron gates, thy sparkling yet moonless meditative gloom, and thy transparent twilight darkling. Or when I write within my room, or lampless read, then sunk in slumber, the empty thoroughfares, past number, are piled, stand clear upon the night. The Admiralty spire is bright, nor may the darkness mount to smother the golden cloudland of the light, for soon one dawn succeeds another with barely half an hour of night. I love thy ruthless winter, lowering with bitter frost and windless air, the sledges along Neva scouring, girls' cheeks, no rose so bright and fair, the flash and noise of balls, the chatter, the bachelor's hour of feasting too, the cups that foam and hiss and spatter, the punch that in the bowl burns blue. I love the warlike animation on playing fields of Mars, to see the troops of foot and horse in station and their superb monotony, their ordered undulating muster, flags tattered on the glorious day, those brazen helmets in their luster, shot through and riddled in the fray. I love thee, city of soldiers, blowing smoke from thy forts, thy booming gun, Northern Empress is bestowing upon the royal house a son. Or when another battle won, proud Russia holds her celebration. Or when the Neva breaking free, her dark blue ice bears out to sea and scents the spring in exultation. So you see, this prologue invokes many aspects of St. Petersburg, the neoclassical architecture and the Neva embankments, the white nights which inspire the writer, the winter pleasures of the aristocracy, sleighing on the frozen river, balls and bachelor parties, the pomp of military review and celebratory cannon fire, and the coming of spring marked by the melting of the ice that covers the Neva. Let's see. I see the time is passing. I'm gonna skip over a bit that I have about this poem as kind of a pastiche of different genres, and instead I'm gonna move on to Gogol, another Petersburg bard who wrote a fantastic set of Petersburg tales in the 1830s. So I wanted to share with you the opening of his story, Nevsky Prospect, which famously uses the literary device of synecdoche to a somewhat uncanny effect. Synecdoche takes one small part to refer to the whole, and in his case, it's side whiskers, mustaches, sleeves, and waists. There's nothing finer than Nevsky Prospect, at least not in Petersburg. For Petersburg, it is everything. What doesn't it shine with, this street, the beauty of our capital? What a rapid phantasmagoria passes over it in a single day. You will meet here unique side whiskers, tucked with extraordinary and astonishing art under the cravat, velvety whiskers, satiny ones black as sable or coal. Here you will meet wonderful mustaches, undepictable by any pen or brush, mustaches to which the better half of a lifetime has been devoted, the objects of long vigils by day and by night, mustaches upon which have been poured the most ravishing scents and essences, and which have been anointed with the most precious and rare sorts of pomades, mustaches which are wrapped up for the night in delicate vellum, mustaches which bespeak the most touching attachment on the part of their possessors and are envied by passers-by. Thousands of sorts of hats, dresses, multicolored kerchiefs dazzle everyone on Nevsky Prospect. It looks as if a whole sea of butterflies had suddenly risen from flower stalks and is fluttering in a brilliant cloud above the black beetles of the male sex. Here you will meet waists such as you have never even dreamed of, little, thin, narrow waists, no thicker than a bottleneck, on meeting which you will step deferentially aside so as not to carelessly poke them with an impolite elbow. And what ladies' sleeves you will meet on Nevsky Prospect. Oh, how lovely. They're a little like two balloons, so that the lady might suddenly rise in the air if her gentleman didn't support her. For a lady is as easily and pleasantly lifted in the air as a goblet of champagne to the lips. So you can see this is a description that reflects the busyness, the bustle, and the kind of show-offy promenading on Nevsky Prospect. But for Gogol, it's also an excuse for a flow of gorgeous words that are, it is verbal art. There's also Gogol's 1836 story, The Nose, which some people are familiar with, an absurdist contribution to the Petersburg text, which also exhibits elements of the uncanny. This eponymous nose mysteriously disappears from the face of a silly civil servant and seems to lead its own independent life in the city before just as mysteriously reappearing back on this person's face. I'd also like to share with you an excerpt from a not well-known piece of writing by Dostoevsky, a kind of a vision, which for him marks his birth as a writer in the 1840s. This is from a quasi-fictional genre called the feuilleton, which has elements of journalistic reportage. So he writes, I remember once on a wintry January evening, I was hurrying home from the Viborg side. I was still very young then. When I reached the Neva, I stopped for a minute and threw a piercing glance along the river into the smoky, frostily dim distance, which had suddenly turned crimson with the last purple of a sunset that was dying out on the hazy horizon. Night lay over the city, and the whole immense plain of the Neva, swollen with frozen snow under the last gleam of the sun, was strewn with infinite myriads of sparks of spindly hoarfrost. There was a 20-degree frost. Frozen steam poured from tired horses, from running people. The taut air quivered at the slightest sound, and columns of smoke like giants rose from all the roofs on both embankments and rushed upward through the cold sky, twining and untwining on the way, so that it seemed new buildings were rising above the old ones. A new city was forming in the air. It seemed finally that this whole world, with all its inhabitants, strong and weak, with all their domiciles, the shelters of the poor or gilded mansions, resembled at this twilight hour a fantastic magic vision, a dream which would in turn vanish immediately and rise up as steam toward the dark blue sky. I seemed to understand something at that moment which up until that point had only stirred within me. I suppose that my existence began at that precise moment. So I hope I've illustrated for you the ways in which Petersburg is at the heart of inspiration drawn by these three very famous writers. And also I would note that this excerpt from Dostoevsky rather recalls the Brodsky excerpt about the stalled train bound for eternity that I read to you earlier. So maybe that's an example of the Petersburg text, Brodsky's essay itself being part of this Petersburg text. So now, briefly, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the kinds of not famous works that I explore, that I enjoy exploring, because I think that to create a more complete literary mapping of Petersburg, we have to consider a more decentralized view of a much broader urban topography that includes non-canonical works and underdescribed spaces. So, for example, the Ukrainian author Yevgeny Grybyenko writes in a feuilleton called The Petersburg Side. He makes a trip to unknown city parts. He says, for Nevsky strollers suffering from melancholy, he prescribes a tour of the Petersburg Side, that poorest part of our capital. He exhorts, look upon the long rows of narrow streets, many of which are not even paved, surrounded by little wooden dwellings. The further you go from Bolshoi Prospect, the quieter, gloomier, and more miserable it all goes. The narrator knows precisely the kind of wallpaper found in the rooms where renters are served their meals, violet or brownish green with scenes from mythology. He knows the exact spot in the center of town where this wallpaper can be purchased. in a little shop on Sadovaya Street, not far from Shukin Market, and the cost, 2 to 2.5 silver kopecks per piece. In another example, a writer named Nikolai Zhivotov wrote an 1894 set of what he called Petersburg profiles. He documents his experiences disguised in turn as a cab driver, a tramp, a funeral torchbearer, and a waiter. His interlude as a cab driver is called On the Coach Box, 6 Days in the Role of a Cab Driver, and he explicitly invokes the genre of the guidebook, as this role requires him to traverse the city according to an entirely new set of urban landmarks, those known by cabbies. He amazes the reader with his mastery of cab drivers' argot in many transcribed conversations. Let's see. Roving reporter Anatoly Bakhtiarov directed his attention to the city's marginal residents in The Proletariat and Street Types of Petersburg from 1895, which opens with a grim sketch of the 5 official flop houses in Petersburg. In the Petersburg text, the cemetery provides one of the most common figures for the city's memory, as well as a favorite subject for cultural historians who use tombstones to chronicle city life. Vladimir Saitov's massive project of 1907 to 1911 took precisely this approach to Petersburg cemeteries, compiling more than 40,000 epitaphs from 57 different burial places in a 4-volume reference that he termed a dictionary of individuals. Nikolai Nekrasov's 1859 Morning Stroll depicts a morose narrator who happens upon a funeral procession. He follows a lonely coffin being conveyed by a dray cart hearse to the Volkovo Cemetery, where he searches for an inconspicuous grave that marks the resting place of a great force, the literary critic Vissarion Belinsky, whom I quoted earlier. The cemetery watchman cannot tell this narrator where his friend lies, but does advise him how to navigate the cemetery. Crosses mark the graves of petits bourgeois, officers, and lower gentry. Tombstone slabs stand above the graves of government officials, while slabs cover the ground over teachers' burial places. The watchman concludes, where there is neither a slab nor a cross, there most probably lies a writer. So Nekrasov's poem fashions itself as a substitute grave marker for Belinsky, whose resting place the narrator of Morning Stroll fails to find. So I'll end there. I've given you some sense of the character of St. Petersburg as a special city and of the breadth of the Petersburg text in the imperial period. And in conclusion, I would note that Petersburg proves the counterintuitive but ancient rule that writing, a seemingly ephemeral medium, perhaps offers the most reliable material for building an enduring monument to the past. Thank you for your kind attention.
I want to start from one thing that you mentioned during our private conversation before the lecture. You mentioned that you lived briefly in St. Petersburg in the 90s, or not briefly, I'm not sure. So when you lived there, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or maybe right before, did you notice any change in St. Petersburg mythology and how people saw their own city? And was this St. Petersburg myth even alive after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Thank you for that question, Anastasia. Yes, I think the mythology lives on and that residents of the city are very proud of it. I spent a lot of time in Petersburg in the 90s and then into the 2000s. In the 90s, I was a graduate student and I spent a year there, for example, researching my dissertation, which I look back on very fondly, and then went very often in the summers. The 90s were like, Petersburg was like the Wild West, you know. It was kind of a very open time. The streets were full of tables on which books were displayed that had not been available before, that had been banned, and people were so excited about that. But there was also a lot of crime. The city was still incredibly beautiful. It still looked like Brodsky's city. And in the 2000s, it started more and more to look like everywhere else with billboards and, shop fronts. And it no longer looked like a stalled train bound for eternity. And Yes, I think there was one part of the Brodsky essay that I didn't quote where he says, the second Petersburg is the Petersburg of literature, of prose and verse that is inscribed on school children as they study this literature, as they all study this literature. And so it's through the literature as well as the city space that this mythology lives on, and I think will continue to live on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. There is a question from Hillary. First, she thanks you for the presentation, and she asks you to clarify what was the name of the literary technique you mentioned with the Gogol excerpt.
Synecdoche.
Synecdoche.
Um, we have metaphor, we have metonymy. Synecdoche is kind of a form of metonymy. So where you might say, you were looking out at the sea and you spied a sail, and by sail you were referring to a boat. So when Gogol talks about all those mustaches and waists and side whiskers, these are people, but he doesn't refer to them as people. Just as in his story, this nose is running around St. Petersburg doing its thing. In the same way, these mustaches and side whiskers appear to take on their own existence.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, there is a question from Catherine, who also first thanks you for the incredible presentation. She's wondering if you'd agree that St. Petersburg seems to be a kind of Gothic city. It seems to integrate the dead with the present well, in
Mhm,
terms of fiction, not architecture. Uh,
mhm, mhm. So, yes, I would agree with that. Many works in the Petersburg text have kind of an uncanny aspect to them. The supernatural, Pushkin's story, The Queen of Spades, kind of hovers on the brink of a supernatural tale and a psychological portrait, and it's uninterpretable. Also, in my book, Mapping St. Petersburg, I have an entire chapter on urban legends. It seems that Petersburg somehow especially seemed to give rise to, dense clusters of urban legends. Some theorists think that these legends took the place of history, since Petersburg had such a compressed history. Um, but yes, I would agree. And then I also have a chapter called The City's Memory that has a very big section on cemeteries, as well as monuments. So I drew from that when I wrote about the Dictionary of Individuals and about Nekrasov's poem. So yes, I agree with you completely.
mhm. There's a question from Lady Agnes. Since St. Petersburg was such a hard place to live environmentally, why did so many peasants move there? I would say probably not even peasants. Was it related to the freeing of serfs and many looking for a life off the land or something else?
Yes, after the 1861 emancipation, life actually became very difficult for peasants in the countryside. So many of them migrated to the cities looking for work or, had golden dreams, just like people from the American provinces coming to New York to seek their fortune, coming to the city with big dreams. And then, of course, the industrialization. There was work in the factories. So, but these cities and Moscow it's the same in Moscow. They were not prepared for this influx. So, you know, and when Dostoevsky writes of slum dwellers, when in one of his earliest works, Poor People, he writes about this poor clerk, middle-aged clerk who lives in his home is this little bed in the corner of a kitchen of his landlady, and he's describing conditions that really did exist. So it's
Mm-hmm.
actually sort of a big historical movement, um, which led to the creation of an urban proletariat.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of my own family story because my great grandmother, she moved from the village to St. Petersburg to just make money because people were literally starving in some villages, and for her, there was no other option than just move to St. Petersburg and try to work in a factory and make the living. So, yeah. Yeah, there is a comment from Victoria and a question as well. She thanks you for this lovely lecture. Victoria is wondering if you think there are any notable contemporary writers who continue the literary myth of St. Petersburg in our times.
There are. I have to say that contemporary literature is not one of my things, but I could point to, for example, the poetess Elena Schwartz, or from the Soviet period, I could point to the writer Andrei Bitov. So yes, the Petersburg text continues. It's alive and well. It continued throughout the Soviet period. If you're interested in contemporary writing, I recommend the new book by my colleague, Professor Stephanie Sandler, about contemporary Russian poetry. It's called The Freest Speech of All. And if you turn to it, I think you'll find some important Petersburg poets of today.
Yeah, I think recently there was also an attempt to publish, I mean, the book was actually published. It was called В Питере жить, In Petersburg You Live. And they combined short stories by many contemporary writers. And I think it was sort of an attempt to prolong this St. Petersburg text to give it a new life in the 21st century. There's a question from Abigail that I will respond to about the Brodsky essay. She's wondering how she can get a copy. It's on our website, on the event page for this talk, but also when I'll be sending the email to all of you guys who have registered either live or to receive the recording, I'll include the link as well. So you'll see it in your email, the PDF, you will be able to read it. And also Abigail, oh, sorry.
Excuse me, I want to just add something to my last answer, which is that literature, strictly speaking, aside, there has been an ocean of books written about every aspect of Petersburg in the post-Soviet period. Dance halls of Petersburg, bathhouses of Petersburg. I have downstairs an enormous bookshelf filled with books about Petersburg. So maybe, I think, well, not maybe, I think we can consider those all contributions to the Petersburg text, and they just keep coming.
Yeah, it never ends. Yeah, so Abigail asked a very interesting question. So you mentioned books in your talk because your book, your own book, is about literary St. Petersburg. But there are also a lot of movies about St. Petersburg that we can also technically consider to be St. Petersburg text. Can you discuss any of the movies that feature the city, or maybe recommend some other works of your colleagues that may help with searching for them? Or yeah, do you have any recommendations?
I mean, again, a Soviet era film is not really my thing, but I did mention Alexander Sokurov's 2002 film, Russian Ark, which is filmed in the Hermitage and which is like an allegory for the Russian imperial period and the memory of it in the post-Soviet period. A film that Russians like to watch at New Year's, Ironia Sudbly, which is set in both Moscow and Petersburg. I mean, there are many kind of popular films that are set in, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's one called Autumn Marathon of beloved Soviet film that's set in Petersburg. So there are a lot. You can find a lot. And then also there's a tradition of incredible Russian silent films from before the revolution. And many of those were shot in Petersburg. And you can they give you a chance to see what Petersburg looked like in film, in the early years of let's say, the 19 teens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were a couple of other questions about movies, and I think we pretty much covered it. Thank you, Tamara, for mentioning the Russian Ark. It might be a hard watch for an unprepared person. I mean, if you don't know Russian, I'm not sure if it's available in translation, but it's
Yeah,
okay. That's great. Yeah, because when I watched it, I was impressed, but it might be not that easy. And
I
yeah,
say if you're going to watch Russian Ark, read up on it a little bit
yeah.
beforehand. It's easy to find the kind of material that will help you because, yes, when you first encounter it, you don't really understand what you're watching. But yeah.
People also mention
It-
Brat, the brother,
Yes, Graz.
is
Yes, yes. The
the
under,
Nazi.
yeah, the underside of Petersburg, the kind of the criminal underbelly of Petersburg. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
made a big splash when it came out.
Okay, great. So Tamara says Russian Ark is on Amazon Prime. So here's our little suggestion. And I'm glad that you mentioned the irony of fate and Moscow and St. Petersburg and this kind of I mean, two capitals, and I myself was wondering, so this rivalry between Moscow and St. Petersburg, did it become part of St. Petersburg identity, like when it was founded, or it sort of developed and formed slightly later? For what reasons, and why do you think that this rivalry exists?
Hmm. That's such a good question because, yes, there are two capitals, really. And in some of the most famous literary works, I think it developed over the course of the 19th century. But you see it everywhere. So in Pushkin's novel in verse, Eugene Onegin, which he wrote during the 1820s, there's a kind of a triangulation between Petersburg, Moscow, and country states in the provinces. And that's sort of the classic triangulation of settings in many works of Russian literature. And Anna Karenina, War and Peace, the same triangulation. And Moscow is, the heart of Russia. It stands for Russianness and Russian orthodoxy and open-souled Russian hospitality and old traditions. And it's removed from the capital, so it's kind of a place more for people's personal life. It has a very distinctive set of characteristics. So, and now Moscow is like a super global capital. And so somebody asked whether the Petersburg mythology and the Petersburg text still exist. And I would say yes. But I think that the old juxtaposition of the two cities is that is that does not represent, Petersburg is maybe back more in the place where Brodsky knew it, very much subservient to Moscow.